is the founder of Reef podcast and is also a chemist on Long Island. And this is her 10th MACNA as a speaker. So please welcome Christine.
Thanks, Scott. We're very loud. We'll probably take that down a tiny bit. So thanks very much for having me, and I'm really excited to give this talk. It's probably one of my favorite ones I've ever done. Mostly because it's not a how-to talk. It's a little bit more of a how do you feel about what it is that you're doing and what we've been doing for as long as we've been doing it. So we talk a lot in the hobby about conservation. We started out this morning talking about that, and I'm sure that we'll be doing a lot more of that during the weekend. And mostly when we talk about that, we talk about numbers. What is it that the food fishery is doing? How many fish do we collect for food fisheries, for the hobby? And how do those two things intersect? And it's a lot of numbers. It's a lot of listening to different organizations attack the hobby and say that we shouldn't be doing what we do. And a lot of it is sort of weighing whether or not we're doing the right thing. So one of the things that I encountered during my travels doing talks was going to the Boston Reef Society and doing something they call fish goo. And this will come back to conservation in a moment. What they do is, and this is sort of a rite of passage for speakers, everyone brings in an item that would be good food for fish, right? So they bring in clams, squid, oysters, roe, different types of seaweed. Everybody brings something in, they thaw it out, put it in a giant blender, blend it up, and split it out amongst all the members of the club. One of the things that the speaker has to do, if you're a good and brave speaker, is you have to take a spoonful of the stuff, as Gary Parr is doing here, and eat it, right? So I can tell you, having done this, that it smells. Yes, it smells. We'll just leave it at that. But it's food, right? It's fish food. But here's the thing: everything that you just heard me say is also human food. So where do we draw the line, right? So that's what we're calling disgusting, because we've decided that it's fish food, but it's really also fit for human use. So it got me thinking, why is it that we draw a line between what is food fisheries and what is for ornamental collection, right? Is there really a line? And how do we determine what is going to be a food fish and what is going to be an ornamental fish? Now, some things are going to be simple, right? They're not fit for human consumption, but not all of them. So really what it comes down to is, how do we as human beings attribute value to the things that we consume, whether it be consume bodily or consume for use in our hobby? And it really is kind of arbitrary, isn't it? The way we decide value of things. And the human brain is a kind of a funny thing, because we will take the same animal, the same species, and on one hand, we will talk about using it here and keep it and spend lots and lots of money to come here and talk about all the ways that we can keep it and spend more money to keep it alive for years. And then we will all come at lunchtime and say, hey guys, what do you want to do? What are we all going to do? We're all going to eat sushi, right? So, and it happens every single time. So how is it that we wrap our heads around this, about how one animal, one species on one day can be our pet and on one day can be our lunch, right? So this is sort of how I started thinking about it. And in the scope of conservation, when we talk about that, what is it that we're conserving? Are we conserving lives, number of lives of animals? Are we conserving an environment and what that does? So what I'd like to do is to talk about sort of how all of these things blend together. Is it that we are looking at our hobby and our lunch as two separate things, or are they really the same thing? Do we have to separate them, or do we really keep them together as one thing? And what I'd like to do, and I'm glad this is actually happening at the beginning of the weekend, is sort of put a little thought into your head for the rest of the time. Think about all the things that we're doing here today. Think about how we attribute value to the animals that we keep. Think about the things that you eat on a daily basis and the things that other people in the world eat on a daily basis. And think about how we attribute that value. Is it arbitrary, right? Why is it that one thing is lunch and the other thing is your pet? And does it matter, right? How do we decide? And how do other people decide? And what does that mean to you? And how does it make you feel, right? So when you walk outside and you look at all the animals in the tank, that to you are a pet, but to someone else is food, and to you on another day could be food. How does that make you feel? So that's the question I just want you to keep in your head as we go through this weekend. So we'll talk a little bit about the numbers of this from a conservation standpoint, but then we'll go through specific examples because I really want to bring it home to a very personal thing. And then we'll talk about recipes, which is probably the most important thing and the most fun part. So let's talk statistics. 1,300 fish species collected and imported into the U.S., and I'm going to rely heavily on a great article by Andy Ryan that I'd encourage you all to read because it really speaks to exactly what it is that we're doing in the hobby. 960 species were collected as food items, 1,000 species collected as ornamentals, and 421 were both food and ornamental. So there is an overlap, right? So how do these things compare to one another? We've got food fisheries and ornamental fisheries. Millions of fish are harvested as food fish, and we're not talking number of species, but number of individual organisms for food. For ornamental, the sum of the number of organisms is less than the bycatch of the food fishery. So point for the ornamentals there. The food fisheries collect larger fish, but probably not reproductive age, right? The ornamentals generally collect smaller fish, but they may be of reproductive age. So you could argue that we are doing more damage to a reef because we're not only collecting that fish, but we're collecting that fish's potential progeny. Food fisheries collect more open ocean fish. We collect reef-associated fish. So we're impacting that fish, but we're also impacting the reef environment. For food fisheries, at the reefs, if people are collecting, they're collecting largely for subsistence fishing. Less money per fish, so they're going to collect more. If they're collecting at the reef for an ornamental, there's going to be more money per fish that they get, so it increases the amount of money that they can get and increases the value of the local habitat. So it's also important to consider the role of each fish. The food fish generally are carnivores. Again, they're larger fish. The role of the reef fish that we collect generally are herbivores. So if we remove those, the reef itself is going to change if we collect enough of them because less herbivores means more algae, which changes the environment. So who eats these, right? Well, outside the U.S., a lot of people eat them, but inside the U.S., turns out your friends eat them, right? Luis Roca from the San Francisco Steinhardt. This was a screw to blenny. Here you go. I'm sorry, a lawnmower blenny. So we don't eat them here. They're probably not too easy to eat here because you can't really buy them in a fish store. But I spoke to Luis, and he said it was actually quite delicious. They just deep fry them quickly. And in certain areas of the world, they're easy to collect and easy to eat and a good source of protein. So yes, your ornamental fish to someone else is just a good meal. Do we eat these things here in the U.S.? Yes, we do. Aside from the things that you would very easily think about, even the ones that you wouldn't commonly think about are readily available. So I went to Chinatown in New York, easy to do. Went through just for fun to see what I could find in the stalls on the street, and found squid, oysters, those easy, you'd imagine those very well, but sea cucumbers, right? Not something you would imagine, but those were very, very readily available. Okay, so let's talk about all the different kinds of things that you can eat from your tank, either as things that you would feed your tank or animals that you would keep. Some of these I have eaten, others I have depended on the benefit of friends of mine in the hobby that have eaten them to get sort of a personal view on what it is that they taste like. And we'll talk about them as we go through. Silversides, we collect these off Long Island all the time. They are a nuisance almost. and they are delicious, I will tell you from personal experience. What you do, you collect them. They pretty much die on site. The way you prepare them, though, is you just quickly pan fry them, and you eat them like popcorn, essentially. And that's what they look like when they're alive, and this is what they look like on your plate. And they're actually really quite delicious. So the pro tip with these, they're often served with either lemon or vinegar. The lemon will make them soggy and not very nice. The vinegar will make them kind of crispy still, so I would go with the vinegar. They both taste good. So if someone offers you silver sides for a meal, take them. They're actually quite good. What do we feed our tanks? We talked about this with Boston Reef, but in Rod's food, for example, and it's not just Rod's food, but a lot of the different foods that we feed our tanks, the frozen foods, read down the list: shrimp, squid, oyster, clam, octopus, perch, scallop, krill. Almost all of these are food that we eat, okay? Fish eggs, seaweeds, broccoli, carrot, mini pellets. Well, perhaps not the mini pellets, but all of those other things are things that we eat, right? All the other things on that list are either vitamins or things that we season our own food with. So there's lots of commonalities here that we're starting to see. Macroalgae, so seaweeds. Who here has not eaten a seaweed salad? Probably very few of you, right? If you go to a Japanese restaurant, they're there all the time. And it's actually quite healthy for you. Also on Long Island, you can go and collect your own. The best way for me, I will say that I've gone to the beach and eaten it directly off the beach, which almost invariably horrifies my son. He's pretty much gotten used to it by now, having done this for a long time. I don't think he understood that beaches are for going to play with your friends and lie on the beach until he was about 12. Because usually, since he was a baby, we would go to the beach and collect things. So he didn't understand what beach really meant until he was a teenager, and he may not forgive me for that for a long time. But you can go to the beach and you can collect gracilaria. You can eat it raw. You can eat it cooked. You can eat chlorpa. It's not as easy to find, but you certainly can. So again, we're having overlap. Not so much a value question here, because we're not talking about living animals. And that's another thing. It's funny how an animal is something we have an ethical dilemma with, but algae we don't. Carrageenan, I bring this one up because the chemical hiding in your organic foods, and this is a great piece of advertising here. I work in the chemical industry, and people who like to talk about or like to use and take in organic, natural foods, or use them on their skin and use them in their laundry detergent and all those things, are horrified by anything that has the word chemical or sounds like a chemical or sounds like it has a very long name. And carrageenan is just a component that is in seaweed. So all of the natural sort of nut milks or non-dairy milks, if they made them without a thickener, would just be like water, right? So they actually wouldn't hold together. Carrageenan is used, taken out of seaweed. It's an extract. It's basically a polysaccharide, so that's used to thicken up the milk to make it more like dairy milk. So there's really nothing not natural about it, and it's pretty much ubiquitous. A lot of ice creams have it. If it doesn't have locust bean gum, it has carrageenan in it. So all of the dairy milks are also, carrageenan is just ubiquitous. You have it pretty much every day. Okay, now we get into the invertebrates where it gets a little trickier. So are you eating invertebrates? Yes, you are. Probably not the ones in your tank unless you go overseas or you go out to look for them, but you can. Tridacnid clams. These are eaten quite often in the South Pacific, or if you are a survivor watcher, you will probably see somebody eat a tridacnid clam if they can find them, because that's probably the only protein they're going to get for the day. This is what they look like when you try to eat them. They're not very happy about it. Once you pull them off the reef, they look like this. They're not going to open up, so you boil them, usually in broth if you have it, and then pull the meat out and eat it. From what I understand, I have not eaten them, but it tastes somewhere between a clam and an oyster. And you can also serve it in a stew. Turbo snails. So turbo snails are eaten in Japan. Let's see if we can go forward. We're not moving forward. Okay, we're going to have problems. Can you guys help me out here? Okay, so we're going to have our tech gurus help us out here. So turbo snails are eaten in Japan. The way these are prepared, and they're actually prepared usually on the side of the road, so you can get them pretty easily. They take the turbo snails and they prepare them actually right in the shell. What they do is they collect the snails. They're pretty easy to find, actually. And turbos, grow to a pretty large size. So if you can imagine sort of almost a hand-size snail, they put them right on a grill. They fill the shell itself with broth, and then they grill them. And the grill allows this turbo basically to boil in its own broth. So once it sits in, let's see if we can do this. Move one forward, please. It won't go past the turbo snails. Wow, this is going to get tricky. Okay, so I'm going to keep talking, and we're going to try to do this. I can move off this machine, too, if you like. Okay, they're going to keep doing this, and we're going to keep talking. So anyway, so they serve them out of a shell. They grill them right on the side of the road. So once they're grilled and boiled right in their own shell, you just reach in with a fork and you can eat the turbo right out of the grill, right out of the shell. So that's actually a really nice way. And from what I understand, they're actually really delicious. If you go right past that, that sounds good. Let's start there. Not there. All right, let's see if we can do this from memory. We're going to go to cuttlefish. So I can see this, you cannot. Cuttlefish are actually served, which is a little weird, and I should apologize to Laura, who's going to talk about keeping cuttles. If you can make that show on there, we'll be in good shape. Cuttlefish are easy to keep here, and so people eat squid, and lots of people eat squid as calamari. Cuttles are a lot less commonly seen. Oh, great. Okay, so here we go. Thank you, guys. Cuttles are a lot less commonly seen, but you can eat them. They're eaten in Greece, actually. I'm going to try to move forward. Can I do it? Yes. Soupios caprates is the dish that's used in Greece. The way these are prepared is you collect them, you slice them up into wide pieces, you saute some garlic and onions, you put the cuttles in, and you give them a quick saute, and then you boil them or simmer them in a broth for 90 minutes. And they're actually supposed to be pretty tasty, so that can be done. Awesome, we're moving forward. Okay, octopus. This is the one probably I have the most problem with as a human being from an ethical perspective. It's easy to eat an animal that's dumb. It's an odd thing, right? So if you have an animal that just kind of wanders around like a cow, you have an easy time eating that. An octopus is a really smart animal, so you can teach an octopus tricks. You can teach them to do things. They open jars. They do an interesting thing. So to eat that animal somehow feels wrong, right? I don't know why that is. So as a sort of conflicted carnivore, this is one of the ones I have trouble with. So here's our friend who's, lovely in the aquarium, and we love to see them. And then they're on the plate, and they're so delicious, right? So how do you wrap your head around that, right? How do you wrap your head around going to the aquarium and seeing those animals and watching them do the things that entertain you, and the animals that you keep at home that you really love, and then going to the Portuguese restaurant, eating them grilled? How do we do that? I don't know, but we still do. Because our brains are a funny thing, and somehow we can hold two completely disparate ideas in our head at the same time, where we can decide very arbitrarily this dialectic that an octopus can be a pet that we pay $100 or $50 for, and then we pay thousands of dollars to keep alive, and then we go in to the restaurant that night and pay $15 for a nice piece of grilled octopus. Think about that. Okay. You can also eat it live. So I'm just going to read this directly. Lemon Teak, a good friend of mine, told me, the weirdest reef animal I've ever eaten is live octopus in Korea. It's wrapped around a stick and eaten as is. I tried it out of novelty, but I hated the taste of it, and because it's alive, the suckers stick onto your mouth, teeth, and throat, making swallow it extremely difficult, not something I would try again ever. So you can eat it alive as well if you are so inclined if you go to Korea. Not something I would try, and I'll eat pretty much anything. This one, I don't know if I would really like to do. And again, this becomes the ethical question too. Eating an animal that's dead feels very different than eating an animal that's alive. Why? The animal's going to end up dead. Why is that different? Why does it matter? Sea urchin, lots of people have eaten sea urchin, right, as sushi. That's what it looks like. If you get it in a good sushi restaurant, you eat it with a quail egg. This is actually just the ovary of the sea urchin, but that's the tasty part. I would actually highly recommend it. It's delicious. Mantis shrimp, commonly served in Spain, actually. And it's a good chunk of meat, too. A good-sized mantis shrimp is, and how is that different from eating, coconut shrimp? How? It really isn't, right? Yet we decide that one is a pet and one is not. And this is what it looks like. It looks like paella, right? Sea cucumbers. Okay, so sea cucumbers I was able to find in Chinatown. I've eaten them there. To me, they taste pretty bland and kind of rubbery, like a tire. Not my favorite food, but pretty easy to find. It's what they look like in our tanks. Here's Joe Waiulo showing us what a sea cucumber looks like in our tanks. I'm really grateful to Joe for helping us out with that. So they are easy to find, and they're actually really good to keep in a tank. They do a good job of sifting sand. This is what they look like dried, and actually the drying process itself is pretty extensive from what I understand. It goes through drying and brine and drying again in order to preserve it. And it makes sense, right? If you're going to keep seafood for a long time without refrigeration, you need to do something. So this is a photo I took actually right on the street in New York City. So it is eaten pretty commonly here in Asian culture. And this is what it looks like when it's rehydrated and basically boiled and served with sauce. Not my favorite, I'll be completely honest. It's served sometimes also in sort of haute cuisine. I would keep it in my tank. Jellyfish are also served. Not a great source of protein because it's mostly water, but again, if you're living in a culture where protein is hard to find, you'll eat it. From what I understand, it's like munching on rubber bands. Okay, vertebrates. Puffer is something we do know about. This is our friend, and this is our food, right? So I guess Doria was wrong, by the way. Puffer is eaten very commonly in Japan. It's also served as sushi. The one thing we all know about puffer is it needs to be prepared properly because it does contain tetrodotoxin. When it's served as sushi, it often looks like this, which I find ironic because recently there was a study published that showed that the male puffer will make a design in the sand that looks like that to attract a mate. So how funny is that we actually served this, and we have been preparing it this way for a lot longer than we knew that they were doing this. So it's kind of insulting, isn't it, that we actually serve it in the same way that they would collect a mate? Again, it goes back to this whole values thing. Parrotfish. Parrotfish are served in Jamaica, and that's one of the more interesting things. So here's our friend. And they're beautiful in the tank, aren't they? The rainbow colors, and they look really nice. Jamaica as a country, if you sort of divert out of the tourist areas, is just a desperately poor nation. I've traveled there for work, and we went outside of the nice tourist areas that they try to keep you in, which are very wealthy and cater to Western people like us. When I was there, we went down through the countryside into farmland, basically, and agricultural areas, and there are people there that are really just subsistence farmers that are doing anything they can just to scrape by. So one of the things that they can do is farm and fish, and they will fish for parrotfish because they're easy to find and they're decent size. But what role does the parrotfish have on the reef, right? It's an herbivore, so if they collect too many parrotfish, there's nobody sort of eating algae and keeping the reef clean, and there's nobody also munching on rocks and turning them into sand. So it's gotten to a point where they're collecting so many parrotfish for food that the Jamaican government is actually working towards creating a ban against collecting parrotfish for food, because there's so much destruction of reefs in the tourist areas, but in general. This is what they look like on just on a regular fish market. I can get them actually right where I work. I work in an area that has a large Caribbean population, so I've actually bought them and prepared them myself here. They're not difficult to find to eat if you wanted to, and they're actually quite tasty. This is what they look like in Jamaica, that you can get them on the side of the road. Sometimes served just in a newspaper, sometimes in a coconut, and you can just grill them. They're actually quite good. But this is where it becomes interesting, right? So everybody's talking about, the horrors of collection for the reef, but here's an example of where the collection of reef fish for food is actually doing more damage than the collection for a reef. Because if we offered to one person in Jamaica, will allow you to collect parrotfish for reef, right? So parrotfish for food, if that person collected 5 fish and was given $1 per fish, that's not very much money, right? They're not going to be able to support a family that way. But if we gave them $20 a fish, that would be life-changing. They would have to collect $20 less, 20 times less fish in order to get the same level of economic support. So that's one way where the hobby can actually turn an economy on its head and can turn an ecosystem on its head. So conservation and value, in this sense, can actually do some good. Okay, lionfish we know about. We've talked about this a lot over the past probably 6 years or so. Lionfish are now so endemic on the east coast of the United States that we're actually encouraged to collect them and eat them. Here's a picture of one of the areas where they have just decimated a reef. So lionfish from malicious to delicious. One of the campaigns is to encourage people to collect them for food. They have lionfish derbies where they go out, divers will go out and spear fish. And there are actually lionfish cookbooks that you can get. From what I understand, they're one of the most delicious fish, except for tangs. And from what I understand from our friend Lemon, probably the most delicious fish he's ever had is a nasotang. So of these fish, and these are these are probably one of the quintessential fish that we keep in tanks. They're also one of the most common fish to be served in fish markets in Asia. So they're prepared, they're large fish, so they're good ones to collect for food fisheries because they can feed, a lot of people as opposed to the smaller fish. And they're grilled, usually wrapped in plantain leaves. The skin is evidently very tough, but once you get through the skin, it's actually quite tender, and the meat is very good. And that's what they look like when they're grilled. So really what it comes down to, and we come back to the beginning, is what value do you attach to an animal? So we've talked about all these fish that we're collecting and all these fish that we're keeping here, but now we've talked about them in a completely different way. We've talked about them as food, right? The very same animals that you keep, now you've had the opportunity to look at them as food items, as things that you would have for lunch, that you would enjoy not for years, but for an hour over a meal with a friend. So how do we do that in our heads? How do we consider these animals, sometimes the very same species, in two completely different ways, and we're okay with that? Well, because reefs is tasty, right? So that's what we know. These animals are not only a joy to keep, but they're actually really enjoyable to eat too. So we somehow have to wrap our heads around the fact that these have two different values and have two different ways of serving us, two different benefits to us. And we have to figure out a way to sort of ethically and morally understand those values to us. So think about this before we go. How do you feel about your $90 nasotang being sold for $6.99 a pound? It's kind of weird, right? We think of these things as these very valuable, very precious items, but to someone else, it could be just, dinner. It's odd, right? And so the quick answer is, well, one's dead, right? Hopefully not yours. But really, they both were the same thing once on the reef. So what's your favorite animal in your tank? We're going to do a thought exercise for a minute. Think about what's your favorite animal, the one that is your most precious. So given the opportunity to eat another one of that species, would you? Would you? Even if it's disgusting, like a fish, or, would you eat it? Would you eat it if you had to? What if it was that individual animal? Would you? It's an interesting question, right? Because many people would. And how do we decide? How is it that we've decided as a group, right, as a culture, but as hobbyists, how have we decided that the animals in the next room are worth something, some value that's 10, 100 times more than the animal that we're going to eat at Benihana? Who decides that? Do we? Has somebody else? Or do we decide that today but not tomorrow? We don't understand. I don't understand. That's kind of why I'm posing these questions to all of you. And why does it matter? Why does it matter that all of these different animals can have one value one day and one value another? I think it matters because conservation is a big issue right now. If we are in a situation where we have to worry about how our hobby is under attack, our hobby is being assaulted, all of these things we need to consider and keep in mind as perhaps a defense, but it's something that we have to think of from an ethical perspective, that these animals, and even sometimes the same species, they're sometimes ornamental animals, right? And they can be collected that way, but the very same animal can be a food animal. So perhaps someone that is attacking the hobby, one of the responses that one can give is that these animals are also being collected as food. So how can you ban collection for the hobby when somebody one reef over is collecting them and eating them? It doesn't make sense, right? So we have to really be careful about our language with conservation, and we have to be careful to consider the entire picture of collection. It's not just ornamental collection that's the problem, and it's not just food fisheries that's the good guys, right? There's no hard line between these two things, because we're very prone to thinking that food fisheries are collecting these animals here, and ornamentals are collecting these animals here. As you've seen, there's a tremendous overlap between the two. So one of the tools that we can use is the fact that these animals do overlap and that we can't separate the two, right? But in addition to that, I think it's useful to think about all these animals that we keep here are also your food. So as you walk these halls today, and when you go home to your tanks, think about how other people might be using those animals. And think about how, because you've attributed this value to that animal, could it be different? And does it mean something different to you now that you know that it could be eaten? It's an interesting way to think about it. So I'm just going to finish up and take questions. Before that, I just want to thank Kevin Erickson, who is the most annoying person ever, but it actually makes a lot of this happen, and MACNA, Lemon Teak, Luis Roca, and Gary Parr, who have just been hobby friends for a long time and have helped put this presentation together with photos. Joe Waiolo for just being a good sport and a mentor for a very long time. Rich, Ben, Chris, and Matt, and my family, Jeremy and Michael, for tolerating all of my fish tanks, 90,000 of them, throughout the years, and for putting up with my incessant chatter about hobby and ethics and conservation and all those things.